The day I walked away from a $12 billion deal, the headlines called it insanity. They were wrong. The real madness was the man I had been the day before. I remember every second of that morning because it was supposed to be the greatest victory of my career. Manhattan glittered beneath the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 62nd floor, each glass tower reflecting the pale light of an early October sunrise. The city looked untouchable from up there, like every street, every rooftop, every ambition belonged to me. Maybe that was the problem. For 15 years I had measured my life in acquisitions, quarterly reports, private jets, and signatures that moved more money in a single afternoon than most families would see in generations. My calendar had no empty spaces. Every hour belonged to someone else. Investors. Lawyers. Reporters. Politicians. Everyone wanted a piece of Ethan Cole. No one wanted the man underneath the tailored suits. At 36, I owned homes I barely visited, collected awards I never displayed, and slept in a penthouse that echoed louder every year. People called me disciplined. Visionary. Ruthless when they thought I couldn't hear them. They weren't entirely wrong. Success had taught me that hesitation cost millions, that emotions complicated negotiations, and that kindness rarely appeared on a balance sheet. So I stopped making room for all three. My assistant greeted me before I reached my office, already matching my pace with a digital tablet pressed against her chest. She listed meetings, interviews, market updates, and a charity gala scheduled for the evening. I answered with short nods, barely listening. Every day sounded exactly like the one before it. Every accomplishment felt strangely identical. Even the congratulations had become rehearsed, polished until they meant nothing. Inside the boardroom, 12 executives waited around a table carved from walnut so flawless it reflected the ceiling lights like still water. Their smiles carried the confidence of people expecting history. The acquisition would make headlines around the world before lunch. Cameras already crowded the lobby downstairs. Financial networks had reserved entire segments to celebrate another empire expanding beneath my name. Someone slid the final contract toward me along with a fountain pen engraved with my initials. The room fell silent. That silence used to feed me. It used to feel like power. Instead, it felt unbearably heavy. My hand reached for the pen, then stopped halfway. For reasons I couldn't explain, my eyes drifted beyond the glass walls toward the streets far below. Tiny figures hurried across crosswalks carrying coffee cups, backpacks, grocery bags, ordinary lives unfolding without billion-dollar decisions hanging over them. I found myself wondering something I hadn't asked in years. When had I stopped noticing people and started seeing only opportunities? The question arrived quietly, almost like a whisper carried through sealed windows, yet it drowned out every projection, every congratulation, every promise of greater wealth. One of the directors cleared his throat, assuming I needed another moment to review the paperwork. If only he knew the document in front of me wasn't what I was examining. I was staring directly at the life I had built, and for the first time, it looked like a prison with an extraordinary view. I did not sign the contract that morning. I simply stood, buttoned my jacket, thanked everyone for their time, and walked out before anyone found the courage to ask why. Confusion followed me into the hallway like an invisible shadow. My phone vibrated almost immediately. The first call came from my chief legal officer. The second from the chairman of the board. By the 10th call, I switched the phone to silent and slipped it into my pocket. For the first time in years, I wanted a few minutes that belonged only to me. The elevator doors opened into the marble lobby where television crews had already assembled behind polished brass barriers. Bright studio lights reflected across the glossy floor while reporters rehearsed their introductions with practiced smiles. My security team looked toward me, waiting for instructions. Normally I would have stepped onto the platform, delivered a carefully prepared statement, answered 3 predictable questions, and returned upstairs before the stock market closed. Instead, I walked past every microphone without saying a single word. The silence felt strangely louder than any speech I had ever given. Outside, the crisp October air carried the scent of roasted coffee from a street cart parked across the avenue. Yellow taxis rolled past in uneven waves while office workers hurried toward buildings with paper cups warming their hands. I could have climbed into the waiting sedan with tinted windows, but something stopped me. I told my driver to take the afternoon off. His surprised expression almost made me smile. I could not remember the last time anyone on my staff had heard me cancel a schedule without replacing it with another. I started walking south with no destination in mind. The sidewalks were crowded with people who never looked twice at me. Without a television camera or a conference stage, I was simply another man in a dark overcoat moving through Manhattan. It was oddly comforting. I passed bookstores, flower stands, and neighborhood bakeries I had somehow ignored despite owning office buildings only blocks away. A little girl laughed as a gust of wind nearly carried away the paper leaves she had gathered from the park. Her father chased after them with exaggerated determination until she burst into even louder laughter. The sound lingered with me long after they disappeared around the corner. I realized I could not remember the last time I had laughed without calculating whether it was appropriate for the room. Nearly an hour later, I found myself standing outside a modest brick building with colorful murals painted across its front wall. Children carried canvases almost as tall as they were, smiling as they disappeared through bright blue doors beneath a hand-painted sign that read Bennett Community Arts Center. Volunteers unloaded folding tables from an aging pickup truck while someone inside played soft piano music that drifted through an open window. It looked nothing like the polished charity foundations that invited me to expensive galas. There were chipped flower pots near the entrance and faded benches that had clearly weathered many winters, yet the place felt alive in a way my headquarters never had. Just as I turned to leave, the front door opened and a young woman stepped outside carrying 2 overflowing boxes of paint supplies. One of the boxes slipped from her hands before she could catch it. Brushes, sketchbooks, and dozens of tiny paint bottles scattered across the sidewalk. Instinct moved me before thought did. I bent down beside her and reached for a roll of watercolor paper that had stopped against my shoe. She looked up with clear blue eyes, offered an embarrassed smile that carried no recognition whatsoever, and said, "Thank you." Most people pretend they do not see a mess unless it belongs to them. For reasons I could not explain, those simple words stayed with me longer than every compliment I had received during the past decade. I handed her the roll of watercolor paper, expecting the conversation to end there. In my world, people usually became nervous the moment they recognized my face. They apologized for imaginary mistakes, straightened their posture, or searched for a way to impress me. Claire Bennett did none of those things. She simply brushed a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear, balanced another stack of sketchbooks against her hip, and continued gathering the scattered supplies with calm efficiency. I picked up several paint bottles and placed them carefully back into the box. She smiled again, warm but casual, the kind of smile that expected nothing in return. "Thank you," she said. "You just saved me 20 minutes of chasing tiny bottles down the sidewalk." I looked at the colorful labels in my hands and found myself asking the first question that came to mind. "Do you always carry this much art with you?" She laughed softly. "Only on the days that end with the letter Y." The answer caught me completely off guard. It was simple, almost playful, yet it felt more genuine than the polished conversations I attended every day. We carried the boxes together toward the entrance. Children hurried through the hallway behind the glass doors, their laughter echoing across walls covered with paintings, paper butterflies, and handwritten thank you notes. Every surface seemed imperfect in the most beautiful way. Paint stains covered the floor near the classroom entrance. A small wooden table leaned slightly to one side. Someone had repaired it more than once instead of replacing it. "Community donations," Claire explained after noticing where I was looking. "Nothing matches, but everything has a story." I nodded without realizing how closely I was listening. She pushed open the classroom door with her shoulder, revealing a bright room filled with easels, jars of brushes, and shelves overflowing with colorful supplies. Sunlight poured through wide windows, making every painting seem alive. A little boy looked up from his canvas and waved enthusiastically. "Miss Claire, look." I finished the sky. She walked over immediately, setting the boxes aside as though nothing else mattered. She crouched beside him, studying his painting with complete attention. You made the clouds look like they are moving, she said. That is not easy to do. The boy's face lit up with quiet pride. Watching the exchange felt strangely unfamiliar. She was not pretending to care because someone important was watching. She cared because that was simply who she was. I remained near the doorway, uncertain why I had not already left. One of the volunteers approached me with a clipboard. Are you here to sign up? She asked cheerfully. Before I could answer, Claire turned around and smiled. He just helped me rescue my supplies from the sidewalk. The volunteer laughed. Well, that counts as community service. I almost admitted who I was. I almost explained that I funded hospitals, universities, and museums through foundations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Instead, I heard myself say something I had not expected. I was just passing by. Claire nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes passing by is enough to remind us there is more happening in the world than whatever filled our morning. Her words landed harder than she could have imagined. She had no idea that my morning had been filled with boardrooms, cameras, and contracts. She had no idea I had walked away from the biggest business decision of my life. Yet somehow she spoke directly to the question that had been following me since I left my office. As I thanked her and stepped back toward the sidewalk, she called after me with an easy smile. Have a good afternoon, stranger. Stranger. Not Mr. Cole. Not billionaire. Not chief executive officer. Just a stranger carrying a roll of watercolor paper. I walked away with the strange feeling that for the first time in years, someone had seen me without seeing everything I owned, and I could not stop wondering why that felt more valuable than every deal I had ever closed. The next morning I told myself I had no reason to return. My calendar had recovered overnight with enough meetings to consume every waking hour until the end of the month. My assistant had rebuilt my schedule with remarkable efficiency, pretending not to notice that I had cancelled the most important announcement of the year. Investors demanded explanations. Reporters speculated about hidden strategies. Analysts invented stories because uncertainty made better headlines than the truth. I ignored all of them. Around noon, while another presentation filled the conference room screen with colorful charts and optimistic projections, my thoughts drifted somewhere entirely different. I remembered paint-stained floors instead of polished marble. I remembered children laughing instead of executives applauding. Most of all, I remembered a woman who had thanked a stranger without asking what he could do for her. Before I realized what I was doing, I closed my notebook and excused myself from the meeting. My board assumed I had another urgent negotiation waiting. In a way, I did. 40 minutes later I stood across the street from the Community Arts Center holding 2 paper cups of coffee from the small corner cafe. I had no idea whether Claire even drank coffee. The thought almost made me turn around. I negotiated billion-dollar agreements without hesitation, yet I suddenly felt uncertain about walking through a blue door carrying 2 ordinary cups. The bell above the entrance chimed softly as I stepped inside. The room buzzed with quiet energy. Volunteers arranged easels while children proudly displayed fresh paintings along one wall. The scent of acrylic paint mixed with fresh cinnamon from someone else's lunch. Claire looked up from helping a little girl tie an apron around her waist. Recognition appeared instantly, followed by the same relaxed smile I remembered from the day before. You found your way back, stranger, she said. I held up the extra cup with an awkwardness that surprised even me. I thought you might need this. She accepted it with genuine gratitude, not excitement, not curiosity, simply appreciation. That is thoughtful. Thank you. She took a sip and laughed. You guessed my order exactly. I admitted it had been luck, and she shook her head with an amused smile. Sometimes luck deserves a little credit. We sat on an old wooden bench near the classroom while children worked on their projects. There was no rush in her voice. No attempt to impress me. She asked where I worked, and for the first time in years I answered without listing titles or achievements. Finance, I said simply. That sounds exhausting, she replied. I smiled despite myself. Some days it is. She nodded toward the classroom. This is exhausting too, but in a different way. At the end of the day, I go home tired. I just never want to go home wondering whether today mattered. Her words settled into the silence between us. I watched a little boy proudly carry his painting to a drying rack while another child carefully mixed blue and yellow into green with complete concentration. None of them cared about quarterly earnings or market valuations. They cared about making something beautiful with their own hands. Claire noticed where I was looking. Children have an interesting way of measuring success, she said softly. If they learn one new thing today or make one friend smile, they believe it was a good day. Adults make life much more complicated. I looked down at the untouched coffee warming my hands. Somewhere along the way I had replaced simple questions with impossible ones. I had spent years asking how to build something bigger without ever asking whether bigger meant better. As afternoon sunlight stretched across the colorful classroom floor, I realized I had not checked my phone once since arriving. Hundreds of messages were undoubtedly waiting. Yet sitting on that worn wooden bench beside Claire Bennett, listening to children laugh over crooked paintings and spilled brushes, I felt richer than I had during any board meeting in the tallest office building in Manhattan. Over the next week I found excuses that sounded reasonable to everyone except myself. One afternoon I claimed I needed fresh air before another investor dinner. Another morning I postponed a strategy session by 30 minutes because I told my assistant traffic would make me late. In reality, my route had quietly changed. Somehow every free moment carried me back to the little brick building with faded murals and bright blue doors. Claire never questioned why I kept appearing. She welcomed me with the same easy smile each time, handed me a paintbrush when volunteers were short, and introduced me to children who only knew me as Ethan. Not Mr. Cole. Not the man whose photograph occasionally appeared on financial magazines sitting untouched in airport lounges. Just Ethan. It was strangely liberating. One rainy afternoon the children gathered around a long table making handmade greeting cards for residents at a nearby nursing home. Construction paper covered every inch of the room, along with jars of markers, ribbons, and glitter that somehow managed to find their way onto everyone's sleeves. I struggled to cut a straight line with safety scissors while a little girl no older than 7 watched me with complete seriousness. She tilted her head before gently taking the scissors from my hand. "You are holding them backwards," she whispered. The entire table erupted into laughter, including Claire. I laughed too, louder than I expected, and the sound startled me because it felt unfamiliar, as though I had rediscovered something I had misplaced years earlier. Claire glanced toward me with amused eyes. "Congratulations," she said. "You survived your first art class." I looked down at the crooked paper stars scattered across the table. "Barely." She smiled. "Nobody remembers perfect. They remember honest effort." Later that afternoon, after the children had gone home, we remained behind stacking chairs and wiping paint from the tables. Rain tapped softly against the windows while warm yellow lights filled the room with a quiet glow. Claire folded a paint-speckled apron and looked at me thoughtfully. "Can I ask you something?" she said. I nodded. "You always tell me where you work, but you never tell me why." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She leaned against the table, choosing her words carefully. "Most people can explain what they do in one sentence. The interesting part is why they keep doing it." I opened my mouth, ready with the polished answer I had repeated for years about innovation, growth, and creating opportunities. The words refused to come. Instead, I stared at the colorful brush marks covering the tabletop. "I do not know anymore," I admitted quietly. Saying those 5 words felt heavier than signing any contract I had ever faced. Claire did not rush to fill the silence. She simply nodded, as though uncertainty was nothing to be ashamed of. "That is more honest than most people ever become with themselves," she said softly. "Sometimes we spend so much time building a successful life that we forget to build one we actually enjoy living." Her voice carried no judgment. Only compassion. Those words followed me all the way back to my penthouse that evening. I unlocked the front door and stepped into thousands of square feet of perfect silence. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering skyline, expensive artwork decorated the walls, and every piece of furniture had been selected by professional designers. Yet the apartment felt colder than the little classroom with its chipped tables and paint-stained floors. I poured myself a glass of water, looked at my reflection in the dark window, and realized Claire had uncovered something every interviewer, shareholder, and business partner had missed for years. She had not seen a billionaire trying to impress the world. She had seen a lonely man quietly searching for a reason to recognize himself again, and for the first time in my life, I was no longer certain that money could solve the question she had placed so gently in my hands. The following Monday reminded me exactly why I had built walls around my life in the first place. The boardroom was colder than usual, although the thermostat had not changed. 12 familiar faces studied me with carefully controlled expressions, their folders already arranged in perfect alignment across the polished table. No one mentioned the cancelled acquisition immediately. They did not have to. The silence carried enough questions to fill the room. My chairman finally folded his hands together. "Ethan, we have spent 2 weeks explaining your decisions to investors. They expect clarity." I looked around the table and realized something that had never occurred to me before. Every conversation in this room began with expectations and ended with numbers. Nobody asked whether I was sleeping well. Nobody wondered if I was happy. They only wanted certainty because certainty protected profits. I answered honestly. "I am rethinking our priorities." Several executives exchanged uneasy glances. My chief financial officer leaned forward. "Our priority has always been growth." I nodded slowly. "Perhaps that is exactly what deserves another look." The meeting unraveled from there. Charts filled the screens. Forecasts appeared one after another. Every slide promised higher returns if we continued exactly as we always had. Normally I would have challenged every assumption with sharper questions than anyone else in the room. Instead, I kept thinking about a classroom where children celebrated crooked paintings because they had created them together. The contrast was impossible to ignore. By late afternoon my mother called, asking me to join her for dinner at the private club our family had visited for decades. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished silver while waiters moved almost silently between tables. She waited until dessert arrived before speaking in the careful tone that always meant concern disguised as elegance. "People are talking about you, Ethan." I smiled faintly. "People usually are." She set down her fork. "Not like this. They believe you are becoming distracted." I already knew what she meant. Someone had seen me leaving the community arts center. News traveled quickly in circles where reputation carried almost as much value as wealth. "I have simply been spending time somewhere different," I replied. She studied me for several long seconds. "Different people can influence your judgment." I looked around the dining room filled with successful executives, investors, and public figures who all knew one another by first name. Then I quietly answered, "Maybe that is exactly what I need." She sighed, not in anger but in disappointment. "Your father spent his life building this legacy." "I know. Do not let emotions dismantle it." Those words remained with me during the drive home. Emotions. The strange thing was that I had spent most of my adult life trying not to feel anything at all. Yet the moment I finally allowed myself to care about something beyond quarterly earnings, everyone around me treated it as a threat. 2 days later I returned to the arts center carrying several new sketchbooks that I had purchased from a local supply store. Claire accepted them with genuine appreciation before noticing the expression on my face. "Rough week?" she asked. I laughed quietly. "Apparently I have disappointed half of Manhattan." She tilted her head with thoughtful curiosity. "Did you disappoint yourself?" The question stopped me cold. I searched for an answer while watching children paint bright autumn trees across large sheets of paper. For the first time in longer than I could remember, the answer came easily. No, I admitted. Claire smiled gently before handing a paintbrush to a little boy waiting beside her. Then perhaps you are finally heading in the right direction. I watched the child dip the brush into bright orange paint without worrying whether every leaf looked perfect, and somewhere deep inside me I realized the people who had always praised my success had suddenly become afraid of my happiness. I was only beginning to understand why. The change did not begin with a dramatic speech or a headline that shook Wall Street. It began with a single sentence spoken during an ordinary executive meeting. We were reviewing another proposal to close one of our oldest manufacturing facilities and move operations overseas. The presentation was polished, the numbers were impressive, and every projected savings figure glowed in bright green across the enormous screen. 10 years earlier I would have approved it before the presenter reached the final slide. This time I asked a different question. How many people work there? The room became unusually quiet. My chief operations officer adjusted his glasses before answering. Approximately 840 employees. I nodded slowly. How many families depend on those paychecks? Nobody answered. They had calculated transportation costs, tax incentives, and profit margins down to the last decimal point, yet no spreadsheet contained the number I had asked for. I leaned back in my chair and closed the presentation. Find another solution. Several executives exchanged confused looks. Ethan, one director, began carefully. This decision could reduce annual expenses by almost $60 million. I met his eyes without raising my voice. Then we will find $60 million somewhere else. The meeting ended with expressions I had never seen directed toward me before. They were not angry. They were bewildered. It was as though I had suddenly started speaking a language none of them understood. By the afternoon, rumors had already spread throughout headquarters. Employees who usually avoided eye contact smiled politely as I walked through the lobby. Others simply looked surprised that I had left my office before sunset. My assistant caught up with me near the elevators holding another folder. There is one more proposal requiring your signature. I opened it while standing in the hallway. It outlined reductions to several educational grants the company had quietly funded for years because they no longer generated favorable publicity. Without hesitation, I wrote one sentence across the front page instead. Funding approved for the next 5 years. Expand the program. I handed the folder back and watched genuine disbelief cross her face. Are you sure? She asked softly. I smiled. More than I have been about anything in a long time. That evening I stopped by the Community Arts Center carrying nothing more than a paper bag filled with fresh bagels from a neighborhood bakery. Claire laughed when she saw them. You are learning our unofficial tradition, she said. Volunteers gathered around the small kitchen table while coffee brewed in an old machine that sounded as though it had survived several decades. Nobody discussed stock prices. Nobody asked what my company had earned that day. They talked about a student who had finally found the confidence to enter an art competition and another child whose grades had improved because someone believed in her talent. I listened more than I spoke. At one point Claire noticed me watching everyone around the table. What are you thinking? She asked. I looked at the worn mugs, the mismatched chairs, and the tired but smiling faces sharing an ordinary meal after a long day. I spent years believing leadership meant convincing people to follow me, I admitted quietly. Now I wonder if it simply means making sure people have a reason to hope when they go home. Claire did not answer immediately. She simply reached across the table and slid the last bagel toward me before anyone else noticed it was there. It was such a small gesture that most people would have forgotten it within seconds. I never did. Because in that simple moment I understood something no business school had ever taught me. Real generosity was never measured by the size of the gift. It was measured by how naturally someone chose to share it. The following Friday began like every other visit to the Arts Center, with children laughing before the afternoon classes even started and the familiar scent of fresh paint drifting through the hallway. I arrived carrying several boxes of new watercolor sets that one of the local stores had agreed to discount after hearing about the program. Claire greeted me with the same warm smile, but something about her expression seemed quieter than usual. She thanked me, introduced me to a few new volunteers, and disappeared into the classroom to prepare for the first group of students. I spent the next hour helping arrange easels and refill jars with clean water, enjoying the simple rhythm that had slowly become the favorite part of my week. Then I noticed one of the volunteers staring at a business magazine someone had left on the reception desk. My photograph filled nearly the entire cover. The headline stretched across the page in bold letters, questioning whether Ethan Cole had lost his instinct for business after several unexpected corporate decisions. The volunteer glanced from the magazine to me, then toward Claire, whose back was turned as she organized paintbrushes. A quiet whisper traveled across the room. Another volunteer picked up the magazine. Within seconds, several people wore the same surprised expression. Claire looked up after hearing her name spoken softly. One of the volunteers handed her the magazine without saying a word. I watched her eyes move from the headline to the photograph. She looked back at me, then at the magazine again, as though trying to fit two completely different people into the same image. "Ethan Cole?" she asked gently. I nodded. The room suddenly felt much quieter than before. Children continued laughing in the next classroom, completely unaware that the atmosphere had shifted. Claire walked toward the small office near the entrance and motioned for me to follow. She closed the door behind us, not out of anger but for privacy. The silence lasted several seconds before she finally spoke. "Why did you never tell me?" I looked at the floor before answering. "Because I liked the way you treated me before you knew." She folded her arms, not defensively but thoughtfully. "You let me believe you worked somewhere in finance." "I do." "That is technically true." Her voice remained calm, which somehow made the conversation even harder. "But you also let me believe you were just another man trying to figure out his career." I could not argue with that. "You are right," I admitted. "I should have told you sooner." She looked out the office window toward the classroom where children proudly held up colorful paintings for one another. "Do you know something that worries me?" she asked quietly. "People with enormous influence often believe they can solve every problem by writing a larger check." I felt those words settle heavily inside me because years ago they would have described me perfectly. "I am trying not to be that person anymore," I said. Claire met my eyes, searching for something beyond the sentence itself. "Trying is important," she replied softly. "But there are people whose lives have been changed by decisions made in offices like yours. Some of those changes were not kind." I swallowed slowly because I knew she was right, even if she did not know the details. She placed the magazine on the desk between us. "I need some time, Ethan." She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse me of anything I had not already accused myself of in countless sleepless nights. She simply walked back into the classroom, where children immediately surrounded her with drawings they wanted her to see. I remained alone in the small office, staring at my own smiling photograph on the magazine cover. For years that picture had represented everything I believed success looked like. Now, for the first time, it looked like evidence waiting to be answered. I did not return to the arts center the following day. Or the day after that. Every time I considered walking through those blue doors again, I remembered the disappointment in Claire's eyes. She had never accused me of being wealthy. She had never judged me for success. What hurt was that I had allowed our friendship to begin with an important truth left unsaid. For someone who valued honesty as deeply as she did, that silence had become its own kind of answer. I buried myself in work, hoping familiar routines would drown out unfamiliar emotions. They did not. My office overlooked the same breathtaking skyline, but the view had lost its ability to distract me. During meetings I found myself staring through the glass instead of at financial reports. My executives assumed I was studying market trends. In reality, I was remembering the sound of children laughing over spilled paint and crooked paper stars. One afternoon my assistant entered carrying a folder of press clippings. Your public approval ratings have recovered, she said with a relieved smile. Investors seem optimistic again. I thanked her, waited until she left, then quietly set the folder aside without opening it. There had been a time when I measured every headline, every ranking, every public opinion survey as though my identity depended on them. Now the only opinion I could not stop thinking about belonged to one woman who had never cared about business magazines in the first place. That realization unsettled me more than any financial risk ever had. 3 evenings later I found myself driving through Manhattan with no destination programmed into the navigation system. The city glowed beneath thousands of lights reflecting across rain-soaked streets. Office towers shimmered like polished glass while neighborhood cafes welcomed late customers escaping the chilly air. Without consciously deciding, I turned onto the familiar block where the Community Arts Center stood. I parked across the street and remained inside the car. Through the large front windows I could see volunteers cleaning brushes after another long day. Claire stood near the back of the room, laughing softly as one of the children proudly showed her a colorful painting. She looked exactly as she had every other afternoon. Calm. Present. Completely focused on the people in front of her. I almost stepped out of the car. My hand even rested on the door handle before I stopped myself. She had asked for time. If I truly respected her, then I had to respect that request as well. I drove away without letting her know I had been there. The silence during the ride home felt heavier than any boardroom I had ever entered. That weekend I opened old company archives stored in a private conference room that few people ever visited. Boxes filled with annual reports, acquisition records, and decades of strategic decisions lined the shelves. I spent hours reading documents I had signed years earlier without hesitation. Factory closures. Budget reductions. Community programs quietly discontinued because they no longer fit corporate objectives. Every page carried my signature or my approval. At the time I had called them efficient decisions. Looking at them now, I wondered how many names had disappeared behind those numbers. How many families had quietly adjusted their lives while I celebrated another successful quarter. Claire had not needed to lecture me. She had simply held up a mirror I had avoided for years. As dawn crept through the conference room windows, I closed the final folder and rested my hands on the table. For the first time since becoming Chief Executive Officer, I understood that changing my future would never be enough if I refused to face my past, and I realized the hardest negotiation of my life was no longer with investors, competitors, or board members. It was with the man I had become. The next Monday I canceled every interview my public relations team had arranged for the month. I declined invitations to leadership conferences, charity banquets, and magazine profiles that once would have been impossible to refuse. My communications director walked into my office carrying a carefully organized schedule and looked genuinely confused when I asked her to clear it completely. "People are asking what changed you," she said. I looked out the window before answering. Then let them keep asking. I had finally understood something important. If I wanted to become a different man, I could not begin by announcing it. Real change was not a marketing campaign. It was a series of quiet decisions made when nobody was applauding. I called the head of our community investment division and requested a complete list of every educational program our company had reduced or eliminated during the past 15 years. The report arrived before lunch. It was thicker than I expected. I spent the entire afternoon reading page after page of closed libraries, canceled scholarships, youth centers that had lost funding, and neighborhoods where promises had quietly disappeared once the headlines faded away. I signed authorization after authorization restoring projects that had never deserved to end. I instructed our legal department to simplify grant applications so smaller organizations without expensive consultants could actually qualify. My finance team questioned the increased spending. I answered every concern with the same sentence. Long-term value cannot always be measured by next quarter. The reactions ranged from surprise to open disbelief, but I no longer felt the need to defend every decision. For years I had demanded immediate returns from every investment. Now I was learning that some returns arrived as trust instead of profit. Weeks passed without my visiting the arts center. Not because I had forgotten Claire, but because I wanted every decision I made to exist whether she ever learned about it or not. If I changed only to earn forgiveness, then I had not truly changed at all. One rainy Thursday evening my assistant entered my office carrying another folder. "There is a small community arts organization requesting support," she said. "Normally requests this size never reach your desk, but I thought you might want to review it." I looked down at the application. Bennett Community Arts Center. My heart paused for just a moment before I carefully closed the folder without opening the financial request inside. "Approve it anonymously," I said. She blinked in surprise. "Do you want naming rights on the building?" "No." "A recognition ceremony?" "No." "A press release?" I smiled faintly. "No one needs to know." She nodded slowly, still trying to understand the answer. After she left, I remained alone in the quiet office listening to rain strike the windows. Months earlier I would have calculated the publicity value of every charitable contribution before signing the check. This time I did not even ask how much it would cost. The amount was irrelevant. What mattered was that children would continue painting, laughing, and believing their ideas mattered. Somewhere across the city Claire was probably helping another student discover confidence through a paintbrush and a blank sheet of paper, completely unaware that the funding question keeping volunteers awake at night had quietly disappeared. She would probably never know my name had anything to do with it, and for the first time in my adult life, that felt exactly right. As I turned off the lights in my office and watched the city shimmer beneath the rain, I realized I no longer wanted to be remembered as the man who built the tallest buildings or closed the biggest deals. I wanted to become the kind of person whose best work could continue even after no one remembered who had started it. Nearly 2 months passed before I saw Claire again. I had convinced myself that keeping my distance was the most respectful choice, even if every street near the community arts center reminded me of conversations I could no longer have. Then, on a cold Saturday morning in early December, my assistant placed a small envelope on my desk. "This arrived without a return address," she said. Inside was a simple invitation printed on thick cream-colored paper. "Bennett Community Arts Center Winter Exhibition. Student Artwork Celebration. Open to the community. No sponsor logos. No reserved seating. Just an invitation for anyone willing to spend an afternoon encouraging children who had worked hard." I stared at the card for several minutes before slipping it into my coat pocket. I arrived late on purpose, hoping to avoid becoming the center of attention. Snow drifted gently across the sidewalks while warm yellow light spilled through the familiar blue doors. The building looked almost unchanged except for handmade paper snowflakes hanging from the windows and strings of colorful lights wrapped around the reception desk. Children's paintings covered nearly every wall, each one proudly labeled with handwritten names and ages. Parents smiled beside framed drawings that no museum would ever purchase, but that meant everything to the families standing beneath them. I moved quietly through the crowd, stopping to admire landscapes, portraits, and imaginative worlds painted with fearless colors. Near the back of the room I overheard 2 volunteers speaking in hushed voices. "I still cannot believe the funding came through," one said. "Anonymous donors never happen like this." The other smiled. "Whoever they are, they gave us 5 years of security. We can finally plan instead of just surviving." I kept walking before they noticed me. Their gratitude was not meant for recognition, and that was exactly as it should be. Then I saw Claire across the room helping a little girl straighten a ribbon hanging beside her painting. She looked up almost by accident, and our eyes met for the first time since the magazine had changed everything. She seemed surprised but not uncomfortable. After finishing her conversation with the child's family, she slowly walked toward me. For a moment neither of us spoke. The familiar silence felt different now. Softer. More patient. Finally she smiled, smaller than before but completely genuine. "It has been a while, Ethan." I nodded. "I thought giving you space was the right thing to do." She looked around the crowded room before quietly saying, "I needed that space." I accepted the answer without trying to explain myself. Then she asked something unexpected. Have you been busy? I almost laughed. Months earlier I would have answered with a list of meetings and business accomplishments. Instead I simply said, I have been trying to become someone I would actually respect. She studied my face for a long moment, as though searching for the polished confidence she once associated with successful executives. Whatever she found instead seemed to ease something inside her. People have been talking, she said softly. My heart tightened. About the company? She shook her head. About schools keeping their programs. About scholarships returning. About community centers receiving support without anyone asking for publicity. Nobody knows why it is happening. I looked away, pretending to admire a watercolor landscape painted by an 8-year-old boy. Sometimes people deserve a second chance even if they never ask for credit. Claire smiled gently, and for the first time since we had met, I noticed quiet admiration replacing disappointment in her eyes. She had not forgiven me because of anything I had said. She had begun believing in me because of everything I had done while expecting nothing in return. 3 weeks after the winter exhibition, the largest decision of my career returned to the boardroom, only this time it wore a different name. Consultants described it as a necessary restructuring. Investment banks called it a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Every presentation promised stronger earnings, greater efficiency, and record shareholder value. Hidden inside hundreds of pages of polished reports was one quiet reality. Thousands of employees across several states would lose the stability they had spent decades building. I listened without interrupting as executives praised the proposal with the same confidence I once admired. When the final slide disappeared, every eye in the room settled on me. They expected another signature. Instead, I slowly closed the folder in front of me. We are not doing this, I said. The chairman leaned forward, convinced I had misunderstood. Ethan, this transaction could increase annual profits by billions of dollars. I nodded calmly. I know exactly what it could do. Another director spoke with visible frustration. Then why would you reject it? I looked around the room, recognizing the same certainty that had once defined my own leadership. Because the price is higher than the numbers admit. Silence filled the boardroom. My chief financial officer opened another spreadsheet, hoping mathematics could persuade me where words had failed. I never looked at it. For years, I continued, we celebrated every quarter without asking who carried the cost of our success. That ends today. Several board members warned me that investors would revolt. Others predicted lawsuits, declining stock prices, and permanent damage to the company. They were probably right. Yet for the first time, fear no longer sounded persuasive. It simply sounded familiar. I reached into my briefcase and removed a second document that no one else had seen. It was my letter of resignation as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately if the board believed my leadership no longer aligned with the company's direction. The chairman stared at the paper in disbelief. You would walk away from everything you built? I answered quietly, if protecting a title requires abandoning my conscience, then it is no longer worth keeping. No one spoke for several long moments. Outside the windows, snow drifted slowly between the skyscrapers, softening a city that usually moved too fast to notice winter. Inside the room, years of assumptions quietly unraveled. After nearly an hour of discussion, debate, and uneasy silence, the board accepted my resignation. I left the building carrying only a leather briefcase that suddenly felt much lighter than it ever had before. Reporters gathered outside within minutes after the announcement reached the lobby. Microphones stretched toward me from every direction. Cameras flashed against the gray afternoon sky. Someone shouted the question every network wanted answered. Was this because of pressure from investors? Another voice asked if I regretted sacrificing billions of dollars. I stopped on the courthouse-colored steps, looked across the crowded sidewalk, and smiled with a peace I had never found during any corporate victory. There comes a moment, I said, when success is no longer measured by what you keep. It is measured by what you refuse to sacrifice. I walked away before another question could follow. That evening, without any announcement or invitation, I found myself standing quietly outside the Community Arts Center once again. Through the windows I saw children painting bright winter landscapes while Claire encouraged each one with patient kindness. For the first time, I did not wonder whether I still belonged in that room. I simply hoped that the man walking toward those familiar blue doors had finally become someone worthy of entering them. 1 year later, the city still looked magnificent from above, but I no longer measured my life by the view outside a corner office window. My mornings now began inside a renovated brick building where the scent of fresh coffee mixed with paint, laughter, and possibility. The Community Arts Center had grown far beyond its original classrooms. New studios welcomed veterans discovering creativity after difficult years, teenagers searching for direction, retired neighbors eager to teach, and children who walked through the familiar blue doors believing their ideas mattered. The walls were brighter now, the roof no longer leaked during heavy rain, and every classroom stayed open throughout the year. Yet the heart of the place had never changed. Claire made certain of that. She still greeted every child by name, still knelt beside every unfinished painting with patient encouragement, and still celebrated effort more than perfection. Some habits deserved to remain exactly as they were. I had accepted a quieter life than anyone expected. Instead of leading a global corporation, I spent my days helping establish independent education and community programs across the country, always placing local teachers and volunteers at the center instead of wealthy donors. Whenever organizations offered to name buildings after me, I politely declined. The work mattered. Recognition did not. One sunny afternoon, a group of middle school students gathered around a long table preparing a mural that would stretch across the entrance hallway. They argued cheerfully about colors, laughed over accidental brushstrokes, and invited anyone nearby to add a small piece of the design. One little boy looked up at me with blue paint covering one sleeve. "Mr. Ethan," he asked, "are you good at painting now?" Claire laughed before I could answer. "That depends on who is judging." I picked up a brush and smiled. "I am much better than I used to be." The boy grinned. "Then you can help with the sky." I stood beside him, carefully filling the corner of the mural with soft shades of blue while sunlight streamed through the windows exactly as it had the first day I carried a roll of watercolor paper inside. Claire walked over and quietly handed me a clean brush without saying a word. There was no awkwardness between us anymore. No unanswered questions. Trust had returned the only way it ever truly could, one honest action at a time. She looked at the growing mural before speaking softly. "Do you ever miss your old life?" I paused, studying the colorful wall covered with dozens of different hands working together to create something none of us could have finished alone. I thought about private jets, towering offices, expensive watches, and headlines that once seemed so important. Then I looked around the room filled with laughter echoing against paint-covered walls and answered with complete certainty. I miss who I thought I had to be. I do not miss who I became. Claire smiled, and there was peace in that smile rather than surprise. As the afternoon faded into the warm light of early evening, parents arrived to collect their children, each carrying paintings that would probably end up on refrigerators instead of museum walls. They thanked the volunteers, hugged their families, and stepped out into the world believing tomorrow held another chance to create something beautiful. Watching them leave, I finally understood the lesson that had been waiting for me all along. Wealth can build impressive buildings, but kindness fills them with life. Power can open countless doors, but character decides which ones remain open after you walk through them. And sometimes the quietest rebellion is not against the world at all. It is against the person you refuse to remain.